Hello and welcome to this new episode of Diversity Matters, a webinar series that explores the impact of migrations, diversities, and mobilities on increasingly super diverse territorial realities. It's hosted by the Center for Migration and Diversity at URAC Research. My name is Johanna Mitterhofer and I'm an anthropologist at URAC here in Bolzano, northern Italy. I'm an anthropologist and I work on issues related to migration, to migrant integration policies, to borders, identities, and many more things. Today's webinar is titled Language, Race, Language and Institutional Categories, and we have four very exciting and also quite diverse speakers who will present their research on the intersections of race, language, and these other categories in schools and societies in three different contexts, so the United States, the United Kingdom, and Italy. We have here with us María Cioé-Peña. She's a Spencer Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. We have Kamran, Director of the Mosaic Center at the University of Birmingham. And then two colleagues from URAC Research, Verena Platzgummer, who's also at the University of Galway, and Andrea Leone-Pizzighella, who is a Marie Curie Fellow here at URAC. The webinar language is English, but do feel free to ask questions in the chat in German, Italian, or Spanish, and we'll try to understand and answer those questions. Use the chat if you can. If you'd want to speak, raise your virtual hand and I'll unmute you once the presentations are done. Teams also offers live captions or subtitles, which you can enable by clicking on the three dots on the upper bar, and then on language and speech or the equivalent in your language. We'll also publish the recording of this webinar on our website. I'll post a link afterwards in the chat. So if you want to re-listen to some parts of this webinar in your own time, you can do so. I won't spend much more time introducing the speakers or the topics that will be discussed because we have a lot of things to discuss and not that much time. So I would pass on the floor to Maria. If you would want to share, if you'd like to share your presentation, you can do so now. And yeah, you have about 15-20 minutes. And then we'll have the other presentations followed by questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Johanna. Good morning, everyone. My name is María Cioé-Peña. As has already been mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, and I'm also currently a National Academy of Education and Spencer postdoc fellow. So today's presentation is a very, very brief attempt to illuminate the ongoing erasure of Black students, particularly Black Latines in schools and additive bilingual programs. Okay. Before delving in, let me briefly share my background and the emergence of this work. So before moving to the United States, I had no real conceptualization of race, believing it to be a purely American construct. I now know these constructs exist in the Dominican Republic, which is where I was born, though less noticeable due to the shared linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Having spent most of my life in the US and most of my K-12 schooling and bilingual education programs within Latinx communities, I am still curious about how multilingual learning spaces shape Latinx identity, particularly here in the US. Growing up, I didn't identify as Black because many of the social and schooling experiences I had led me to believe that I couldn't be Black. Over time, how I've identified has changed. However, my questions about language, Latinidad, and racial identity really solidified in the summer of 2020. Oops. In 2020, as the US was having its racial awakening, I was noticing the ways that educational organizations in the US focused on Latinx and bilingual education were responding to or engaging in the discourse of anti-Blackness. For me, como negra, right, so as a Black woman, the discourse was overwhelmingly disappointing. Across educational systems and institutions, the focus is on language, often centering culture to circumvent race, treating language as a connective yet racially neutral entity, right? However, as critical scholars have shown, language and perceptions of language users are not racially neutral, and practices that are rooted in this ideology create more harm than good. So since 2020, I've continued to witness and experience how Black people are erased from Latinidad, right, and from bilingual education here in the US in particular. As such, the following questions served as a guide in this inquiry, right? So what is the role of anti-Blackness and model minority narratives in language education? What are the needs of racialized language learners whose practices are positioned as foreign and deficient? And what is the impact of erasure of Black Latines from language education and discourse? While emerging from my life, this work is deeply rooted in theory. The leading anchor for my framework is Crenshaw's theory on intersectionality, and it's further informed by Black feminist thought, acknowledging the transformative contributions of Black women in shaping our self-perceptions and envisioning the future. Testimonios serve as an epistemological stance to reclaim power by sharing personal experiences in an effort to combat external systems of power that aim to define and constrain identity. Additionally, settler colonial theory was utilized to examine how colonial legacies influence systemic oppression, language use, and identity formation in predominantly monoethnic spaces. And I really like to think about language as an ongoing settler colonial project, serving as a powerful tool in shaping conceptualizations of Latinidad in particular. Lastly, a racio-linguistic perspective was used to explore the interplay between race, language, and appropriateness, highlighting how linguistic practices contribute to the racialization of Black and Indigenous people. And this intersectionally rooted framework reveals how colonially rooted systems of oppression are activated through language, linguistic practices, and institutionally imposed labels, shaping the relationship between Black identity, linguistic performativity, and Latinidad, especially in the United States. In the interest of time, I'll provide a very brief methods overview. However, before I move on, I do want to warn that there are 2 slides that include reference to the N-word. And the first is next. Actually, there's only 1 slide today. So over the summer of 2022, I wrote out 3 recollections of critical racializing moments in my life. I did this using guidelines stemming from descriptive inquiry. I then analyzed the recollections individually using thematic and narrative analysis. Subsequently, I engaged in a comparative analysis to identify recurring themes present across all 3 recollections. I then engaged in triangulation by sharing the recollections with a group of colleagues and students on an individual basis, as well as in a group setting during a doctoral research seminar at UPenn. From the data surfaced 3 themes around how anti-Blackness emerges and is reinforced within language education. In the interest of time, I will not be addressing the individual recollections, but rather focusing in on the themes that emerged from that work and that was reinforced by the experiences shared by other participants across studies I previously directed. So in the first one, we're gonna, so the 3 themes we have are white-Black dichotomies, linguistic policing, and then Black-Latina erasure. So when talking about white-Black monoliths, I'm referring to the idea that a student can only be one or the other. They can be bilingual or disabled, they can be Black or Latinx, they can be normal or broken. Simultaneously, they're viewed through deficit perspectives that position racialized children as in need of remediation at baseline, right? This is in contrast to white students who are positioned as typically developing, gifted and talented, and more than capable of multilingualism, as we see through the gentrification of bilingual education. So here we see how monoliths contribute to the erasure of Black students from dual language bilingual education programs, which are believed to be the most academically rigorous and linguistically supportive. As such, Black children are denied access first on account of their race, by denying the existence of Black Latinx children. Simultaneously, the racialization results in increased placements in special education, which denies them access to bilingual education on account of their disability needs, just as bilingual ed and language ed gets co-opted as a gifted and talented and enrichment setting rather than a culturally sustaining educational practice or space. I'm going really fast. I'm really sorry, but hopefully we're coming along. And so for the second theme, we have that emerged from this work was linguistic phenomenon. And so this surfaced from my autoethnography and from my work at large. And I refer to it as linguistic policing. And by this, I mean the constant assessment of the ways in which racialized people use language. So this policing can occur across name languages. For example, there's an unspoken requirement for Latinx to speak Spanish. And if you do not, you're often considered to be a subpar member of the Latinx community. On the other hand, as Black Spanish users, Dominicans like me, find that the way that they speak Spanish is positioned as bad or problematic. In both situations, the way one uses language is constantly being monitored. Both examples are also rooted in racist and ableist perceptions of languages and language users. And for this, I kind of want to point to the shot that's on the screen from a TikTok video. And I've kind of put into that little red box the text of how this video is described, and it's described as normal Spanish with a flag of the Spanish flag, right, next to it, and then versus Dominican Spanish. And this is one of the ways in which we really start seeing how ableism emerges and kind of is co-constructed with racism, right? So you have a white language practice being positioned as normal, right, and a Black language practice being positioned as oppositional to that, right? So not normal. So linguistic policing also clearly contributes to concerns that exist around students of color being disproportionately overrepresented in special education. But it also then legitimizes the exclusion of disabled people from bilingual programs like dual language. The third theme to emerge from the work is Black Latina erasure. The erasure of Black people within conceptualizations of Latinidad influences people's perceptions of who can and cannot be bilingual, which then determines whose language practices are valid and whose are not. These elements stem from colonialism and are often promoted as part of model minority ideals, although not dubbed that. So model minority narratives are often associated with Asian American cultural dynamics. However, I posit that this ideal is what drives many current bilingual education discourses around bilingualism as a superpower. This push for bilingualism as a marker of excellence, economic advancement, and intellectual prowess was done to counter historical narratives that position Latinx people as deficient on account of their bilingualism. However, we have now strayed so far that bilingual programs have been positioned as gifted and talented and enrichment programs in order to appeal to the white gaze. Yet, this very move is what leads to the exclusion of racialized and pathologized children from these programs on account of lack of rigor or lack of excellence. So as language educators and scholars, we must take note of how our desire to promote particular policies or to correct historical wrongs can result in new forms of exclusion, even as we aim to make dual language and language education more broadly, more expansive. So we have to be asking ourselves, expansive vote for who? Who do we believe has a right to these seats? Who do we believe we want to be seen as bilingual, and to what end? So these theories and ideological moves manifest in material harm for children, and these harms are often cyclical and feed off of one another, with one exclusion begetting another, right? So here I've listed kind of the ways that erasure happens for these kids. So first we see segregation of students by language learner status, right? So they need to learn English, so we remove them from bilingual spaces on that account. We see segregation then by learning needs, right? These students get classified as having a disability, so then they get denied access to their language skills in that way, right? Then we also see the exclusion of non-L Black students who are just not viewed or conceptualized as needing to be bilingual. And we also see this exclusion happening in curricular materials, right? So a lot in this last image that I shared, right, a lot of the material shows these white presenting or indigenous presenting Latinos, but no real presence of what Black identity looks like within this community. And then finally, we see this positioning of bilingualism as superpower as another way of denying access on account of rigor, excellence, and normalization. So how can we address anti-Blackness and Latinidad? Well, first, we need to recognize that language and anti-Blackness serve as identity, property, and shelter for Latinas, particularly for immigrants who are categorized as Black, right? And it's important that we understand that students not only need access to languages that they have from home to maintain their multilingualism, but also language to describe the experiences that they're having, right, in new contexts. So I didn't know how to talk about race and racism because I had never considered myself Black and had never been given that context in my country of origin. But once I changed spaces, right, I needed that context, I needed that language. And so this is really a multi-layered study because it looks not only at language across named languages, but also internally, what are the linguistic skills and vocabulary that children need in order to describe their racializing and pathologizing experiences in the US. Second, we need to recognize that we are excluding Latin American members of the African diaspora, right, from curricular materials, which erases them physically and visibly, right? We're also then leaning into these racial archetypes that exist, and we have to recognize that they exist across countries, right? Racism, slavery, those are not, housed solely in Western countries, right? They also trickle down and are really embedded in the fiber that exists in these other in countries in the global South. Yeah. So the erasure of Black Latinas and the equating of Latinidad with mestizaje highlights how narratives of integration are used to promote false senses of progress and equity, including within US-based Latinx spaces, especially across schools and language education programs. If we want to truly tackle issues of oppression within language education, then we need to do so with an intersectional lens in place. Black Latinas exist in Latin America, in the US, and the world. As such, their existence should be visible within language education. We want to be seen and heard in all of our languages, in our full humanity, and in all of the spaces that we inhabit. Thank you. I made it.
Thank you, Maria, and indeed you made it with even a minute to spare. So
Here are my references, just in case.
References with a minute to spare. No, thank you so much. I think there's lots of things and questions and topics that we could maybe then explore later in the discussion. I would now pass on to Kamran Khan, who will now go to the United Kingdom, the UK, and discuss the intersections of citizenship, race, and language in a slightly different context, also in relation to security. So thank you, Kamran.
1 second, I'm just going to share my screen, if that's all right. If I can find the option, 1 second. We did this earlier on, right? 1 second. Yeah, got it. So. Okay, does that look okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So no, thank you so much to the organizers and everyone who's here. I think it's actually my first time speaking in a Italian context. So I'll try to share various things, some of it empirical, some of it just giving some ideas about other contexts that I'm familiar with. So I usually start these talks with so this is from The Monolingualism of the Other by Jacques Derrida. And when he's talking about monolingualism, he also talks about citizenship, and he talks about how, in essence, a citizenship does not sprout up just like that. It's not natural. And he was always attentive to the very artificial nature of drawing lines between particular groups of people, whether it's inscribed through law. And he continues that, but as in the flash of a privilege revelation, the artifice and precariousness of citizenship appear better when it is inscribed in memory as a recent acquisition, or better yet, in the traumatic memory of degradation. And this is usually through citizenship. And the reason why this is so significant is because he was an Algerian Jew, and he had his citizenship taken away from him, basically in the 1940s, as the kind of rise of Nazism was taking place. Now, Jewish people in Algeria had been granted citizenship by the French in 1870. So in a space of 70 years, the same group that kind of been promised citizenship also had it taken away. And that's a really significant kind of starting point whenever we have discussions about citizenship and race, particularly in Europe, just to be aware of the kind of historical kind of continuities. And obviously there's going to be things that are kind of reformulated in other ways, but how these things can be precarious, particularly for those who are threatened on the margins of citizenship. So in recent years, there's been a kind of push towards including language as a condition, basically, to gaining citizenship. And DJ Gremlin's talked about this idea of jus linguarum, in terms of combining language and citizenship. And obviously that inevitably draws us onto issues of race and class, especially in the case of the UK. Now, these classifications are really significant because they're not just classifications, but there are ways of basically managing groups of people and difference. And obviously, with the kind of discourses that we have and the policies that we have at the moment, particularly around immigration, in Europe, and going to focus on the UK to start with, we have to be really attentive to the work that these categories are doing and the kind of delineations that they're making, right? So I position citizenship language tests as forms of borders, basically, because they feed into a wider social political kind of apparatus. And one of the things that I was trying to kind of push against is just seeing citizenship tests as purely citizenship tests and focusing on what they are and their questions rather than what they do and the kind of inequalities that they can create and the type of policies that they're kind of embodying. So I've written about kind of the securitization of.
I think you're frozen, or maybe it's just for me, but we can't hear you, Kamran. So let's wait for a second. Probably an internet issue.
About particular context. Am I back?
Yeah, now you're back.
Did I leave? I don't know what happened. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Sorry. All right. Okay. So anyway, so I was back on borders anyway. So what we need to know basically is the work that these tests do, and the type of people who kind of oversee these borders, right? So that just continues one of the themes. I'm not going to go into like a heavy Derrida session today, but one of the things he did position was language as a form of border. They kind of named variety languages in particular, and people associated with those create kind of borders and kind of delineations and separation and difference between people and the kind of the issues that this raises, particularly in making people what he describes as being undecidable. That there are certain people who will have a question mark above them, and they'll be the ones who are most vulnerable, basically, to harmful practices, whether it's exclusion, etc. And that's what we see here. So I'm just going to focus today on just two kinds of borders, basically. And the first one really starts with the citizenship test within your application to be naturalized. So some context here for the UK. The 2001, I guess, is kind of the key year really in the current configuration of citizenship, because in that time we had riots in 3 northern cities in the UK, and basically there was this kind of escalating tension through that summer of far right kind of extremists going into predominantly British Asian communities, and they kind of trying to take advantage of kind of tensions, and it eventually exploded into these kind of scenes. Local communities, the Asian communities, didn't feel the police were protecting them well enough. But what was significant was the aftermath of that, in which 3 reports the following year basically placed the blame on migrant communities for not having what they described as, a common standard of English. So the idea was that because they didn't all share the same language, it kind of created the tension, and for basically this type of kind of violence, basically. So if that was the cause of the tension, then the focus then would be on citizenship. And one way of kind of really focusing on citizenship was to deal with what they saw as, this kind of problem of multilingualism and kind of imposing English for people becoming citizens. Now, it's worth pointing out here as well that the people involved, they're all born in, generally born in the UK, but this led to legislation for for migrants, basically. So this connection between violence and language proficiency, then we can see play out here. It's worth pointing out, obviously, 2001, it's just before 9/11 happened. And so what happened was this kind of framing that, this problematic group here, problematic group in caused the terrorist attacks in the US. They were able to kind of frame that with the same kind of group, basically, and they took advantage of that. So what we see here is that I'm using Didier Bigo's idea of insecurity and security being linked, basically, that security and what's required to kind of consolidate security requires commensurate kind of form of insecurity. So monolingualism here, particularly of English, is seen as a kind of a way of maintaining security, and there are particular groups that fall outside of that, therefore that threaten that security. And this is obviously through citizenship as well. So we actually had a language requirement in 1981. So that's very significant because so desperate were the British government to kind of cut down on immigration that they basically delinked from the Commonwealth. So until then, we didn't have national citizenship because we were considered an empire. So people who formed a part of that empire had varying degrees of kind of claims to becoming citizens here. So rather than kind of dealing with that kind of the immigration that allowed people to kind of use, the British government basically created national citizenship in 1981, and then it basically became kind of reinstated in 2002, and that's when we had standardized tests for the first time. That's what you needed to become a citizen or get permanent residency. So this is kind of Britain's way of, it's never really been a nation, it's always been an empire, and it's kind of management of colonial populations, but it's kind of a byproduct from that. So we did research in the University of Leicester, led by Leah Basil and Pierre Monforte. And I'm just going to share just 2 or 3 kind of interviews that we did. There's 158 interviews here of people in various degrees of on the pathway to citizenship. And what you'll see here, just in terms of what the test is doing, is the way in which non-European, so generally women of color, were kind of further isolated by these kind of tests, basically. So you'll notice it's also very gendered. So this is the type of thing. So access to test support was a real problem. So this is we couldn't say exactly where she was from, but you'll see here, someone who basically said, look, they need £151 to do with kind of childcare and education, and that's really difficult to prepare for a test, to deal with the kind of things that you need to do if you have various care responsibilities. So this was a common theme of gender, of motherhood, and costs, etc. So another one where a mother has 2 children, just doesn't have time to be able to deal with the preparation book for the citizenship tests. And again, just made them more isolated at a time when integration discourses are so prevalent. So it's actually isolating people a lot more, particularly a vulnerable group here. So we also have to take into consideration this role of integration within securitized policies, but also in terms of what they do in terms of settled population. So I've just kind of briefly looked there about those seeking naturalization. I'll come back to other examples shortly, but this is just another example in Spain. So this was the context I was working on, which I'll just make reference to briefly. So again, in Spain, there are various requirements. So you can see there's a civic education test on the left and a kind of generic language test on the right. Now, what's really significant here is that the role that the police plays in basically at the discretion of interrupting these tests and checking basically identification and nationality of the people while they're taking the test. So obviously it's not super common, but from just various people I know involved, it's the threat's always there. So you can see it as this kind of site of security and border maintenance. So I'm just going to skip over quickly. So this is another form of border making, but in this case, you'll see it's actually people who, actually live in the Danish context. So they're not seeking naturalization, they're already settled. So in Denmark, they have what they call the ghetto policy. So it's really called the ghetto policy. where they want to eradicate what they refer to as parallel societies. And that's really significant because the justification for the citizenship tests in the UK are based on parallel communities. That was kind of the policy buzzword at the time. So then what makes a ghetto a ghetto? There are various kind of criteria. So on the 1st of December every year, the Danish government publishes a list of ghettos, and they have to fulfill various criteria. We don't need to go into super detail now, but one of them is based on unemployment, one of them is based on crime, one's on education, and one's on income. So of that, two of those four need to be met to be considered a ghetto. The most significant one is this. If you just go into the middle of the circle there, half or more of the residents are of non-Western descent. And that doesn't just refer to people with naturalized status, but refers to their descendants, to migrants, those who like literally have Danish passports and are citizens. So you can see just how racial it is and the kind of categories it's creating in terms of distributing risk. So just for illustration, then blue is Western and red is Western and blue is non-Western. So it gives you an idea of the type of people who get targeted through these policies. Now, in terms of language, then, I mean, it's been criticized by the United Nations, this policy, but you just see in the first paragraph there that under laws when they are 1 year old, so ghetto children, so the kids born in these specific areas, may be separated from their families for 25 hours per week to receive instruction in Danish values and Danish language. So the idea is that they're kind of assessed in a particular way. And if their Danish is seen as not as kind of, as to a specific level, the idea is that they'd be separated for mandatory kind of exposure to Danish values and language, even at that age. So that's actually what I'm working on at the moment. So I'll maybe at some point in the future come back to that. So we have to think about the way this works in terms of surveillance of borders. And not only surveillance of the borders, but the ways in which people and populations get distributed into particular forms of risk and categories that determine the treatment and kind of risk and stigma that they will face. So that just gives you an idea, back to the idea of insecurity and language, the way in which language is kind of racializing in different ways in both these contexts, and the ways in which borders are kind of used as a way of delineating forms of governance. So we just have to think about the way integration discourses merge with securitization, whether it's racial surveillance or border making, but also have to stay aware of the social inequalities that even things like naturalization can reproduce, and really be thinking about social sorting as a form of distribution of risk, particularly the ways in which language policy is used in these contexts. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to end it there. We have a research group on multilingualism, which everyone's free to join. We have events, so yeah, if you're interested, you can join our group. So I'll just stop sharing there. Okay.
Thank you, Kamran, for adding even more layers to the complex topic of the webinar we have today, because it's not just about different countries or contexts, but also about the various layers of what language is actually all about, or what politics and policies do with and about language. Now I'll give the floor to my colleagues from Europe, Verena Platzgummer and Andrea Leone-Pizzighella, who will now move the discussion to Italy, to the context of Italy and schools and categories, some of those categories and the way they're used in the practice of teachers. So I don't know who will start or how you will divide your session, but I'll be quiet. Yeah. Good.
Okay, thank you everybody for being here. Andrea and I have both been working on 2 different school-based ethnographies in and beyond the Italian province of South Tyrol in the last couple of years. And in our work, we noticed an entanglement of language with race and ethnicity, in particular institutional categories in and beyond education. But we also noticed that this was never talked about in terms of race. So while we will not be sharing data from our research in this talk, we do want to provide a critical contextualization of the workings of education in South Tyrol, also touching on how Maria's and Kamran's work pertains to it. For us, it was especially fruitful to work on this together, since we could bring our different perspectives together. So I was born and raised in South Tyrol, like my parents and grandparents before me, and therefore grew up with particular narratives of what South Tyrol is and should be, while Andrea came to it for her research via the United States and other regions of Italy, which have their own narratives about race, language, and other categories. And she's using those perspectives to understand what she sees in her research in South Tyrol. Among the attendees of this talk, there are also probably different gradations of familiarity with South Tyrol. Some might already know that it is an autonomous province in the Alpine area of northeastern Italy, bordering Austria and Switzerland. And some might also know that the governance of the province is organized around the protection of the rights of 3 historical ethno-linguistic groups in the province, and or that it is today known around Italy as being a wealthy, clean, functional province where people also speak German and Latin. Some of you might even have heard the common but highly problematic comment, South Tyrol isn't even Italy. On the one hand, this comment might be read as typical ritualistic Italy bashing, as a kind of self-deprecating comment made by someone from another part of Italy, which is often substantiated by a comment such as, "You guys don't know how good you have it in Bolzano," compared to other parts of Italy. But on the other hand, this comment can easily be read as a thinly veiled, xenophobic, or even racist statement against people from South Tyrol, that they are not part of real Italy, or that Italians who speak German or Latin are not really Italian. While we don't have enough time to talk about the history in much detail today, we do believe that an overview of it is fundamental to understanding both the current state of things and the discourses that circulate about them. So here's what's relevant to understand about language identity and institutions in South Tyrol. The territory and its mostly German and Latin-speaking population became part of Italy through a redrawing of borders after World War I, and almost immediately became subject to forced Italianization under fascism for the 20 years that followed. And this involved replacing all German language practices and institutions with Italian ones, including education, as you can see on the slide. So what you see in this letter is a woman was expelled from her town in South Tyrol for running a German language school in 1926. A picture of one of those schools you can also see on the slide. And the fascist regime also forced Italianization through heavily incentivized in-migration of Italian speakers, eventually also arriving at incentivizing the out-migration of German speakers to the Third Reich. After World War II ended, the first autonomy in South Tyrol was established in 1946. This statute, however, proved unsatisfactory, as demonstrated with protests and physical violence in the 50s and 60s, as you can see in the pictures here. And so it needed to be reworked. And after intense local, national, and international attention to the issues in South Tyrol, a second autonomy agreement was established in 1972, guaranteeing protections for the German, Italian, and Latin-speaking populations via an increased legislative, fiscal, and political autonomy for the province. So in this sense, the story of the German and Latin speakers of South Tyrol is a story of ethnic discrimination, of attempted erasure via sociocultural oppression, and of an eventual reparations agreement, which fortunately works for maintaining the rights of historical ethno-linguistic groups in the territory. And here I pass on to my colleague, Andrea.
Okay, let me take us back a slide here. So, so these three groups are represented in all of the province's institutions, and their populations are regularly monitored to ensure a proportionate distribution of resources. And this monitoring includes a census every 10 years, which asks language group affiliation. This slide shows the trilingual invitation to participate in this census. And aside from that, anyone living in South Tyrol who, for instance, wants a job in the public sector must also declare their belonging or affiliation to one of these three groups. Note that anyone declaring the other category in this option to affiliate with a group is anyway redirected in the following sub-question to affiliate with one of the three historical minority groups in the territory. So it's easy to see how this can get really tricky. On the one hand, the stability of the region relies on the careful categorization of people, but on the other hand, these categories are essentializing and therefore systematically erase anyone who doesn't identify with one of the three groups. So what does this look like in practice? Taking schools as an example, we have three separate school boards ideated for the three separate ethno-linguistic groups. And while enrollment by anyone into any type of school is allowed, regardless of which language group they subscribe to, their residence, their citizenship, etc., the German and Italian schools only have their group's language as the medium of instruction. The Latin schools are trilingual, but we won't get into that right now. So considering that the percentage of non-Italian citizens in South Tyrolean schools has gone from 1% to about 12% in the last 20 years, the already very delicate question of ethno-linguistic preservation and separation in South Tyrol has become more complex. So, for instance, some German speakers and German-speaking politicians have been lamenting for years now what they mostly phrase as a lack of German-speaking children in their schools, since South Tyrol has additional resources to assist with the integration of so-called outsiders into the historical language groups, including the provision of language centers which collaborate within and across the three school boards, as well as a type of teacher unique to South Tyrol, the integration support teacher. There would seem to be several ways of accommodating new students, even if purely in a one-way integration format. From a different perspective, however, these laments of German-speaking politicians might also mean too many children who speak other languages being present in the school, which encompasses both Italian speakers and speakers of other languages, and slightly turns the lens away from potentially practical issues like being able to hold a lesson in German and toward issues that are clearly non-linguistic. So with this in mind, we believe that Kamran's and Maria's work is highly relevant to what's going on in South Tyrol. So Kamran's work on ratio-linguistic border regimes makes evident to us how such regimes play a role at multiple scales and for multiple purposes in South Tyrol. And here it's not a question of policing national borders via passport checks or policing citizenship via assessments, but we do see the same function of language utilized as both, as he says here in this quote, a hard and fluid boundary in various aspects of public and private life. And as Maria's work has shown us, centering language in South Tyrol has partially been a means of circumventing race in public discourse. So considering the turbulent history of Nazism and fascism in Central Europe, distancing South Tyrolean autonomy from questions of race is completely understandable, but recent demographic changes in the region are pushing back against this ambiguous and largely implicit meanings of group identity and their institutionalization. So we see reflected in South Tyrol a continuation of European history and the social issues that plague it, in which are slow to be confronted, but which are necessary to confront. So with that, we will close this brief presentation and open the floor to discussion.
Thank you, Andrea and Verena, for, in a way, bringing together the three contexts in a way. We now explore these intersections of various categories in schools and society more broadly in those different contexts, and could obviously now spent hours discussing all the different questions you raised and the very real implications that you show that they have not just on the institutions where they take place or on the policy makers, but actually on the people themselves, on us, or at least on some of us. We don't have that much time left, so I'd like to now give some space to potential audience questions from the audience or comments from those who now listened to us speak for the last 45 minutes. If anyone has questions, you're very welcome to share them in the chat or raise your hand. Obviously, also, if the speakers have questions or comments to each other, I do not want to exclude you from getting involved in the discussion, especially now that Andrea also mentioned Kamran and Maria again in relation to their work. So if there's any questions from you or from the audience, please feel free to post them. Otherwise, while I was listening to the different discussions and then also looking at the list of people listening in, I noted there's quite a few people who are not academics, but who are actually practitioners in the fields of education in South Tyrol and beyond, but also in the field of, I guess, integration policy making. So I was just wondering if for a moment or for the next 2 minutes, 5 minutes or so, we could maybe move away from the more academic theoretical focus and the frameworks you presented to maybe think about maybe the key takeaways or, some of the inputs that you think your research and your work might also have for practitioners, so for people who actually work in or on the fields that you research in. I know that, for example, in Maria, some of your articles that I found that really interesting, you do not just give, you also in a way include suggestions for teachers or for policymakers based on your research. And I found that very interesting, since all of the research you do, I think all of you have very concrete links to what's actually going on currently in the field. So I don't know if any one of you might want to talk on that very briefly. Who wants to start? Maria, do you want to start? You need to.
Yeah. I have a question. I had a separate question, but if you can repeat your question, I'm happy to start.
So my question was just, what are the practical implications, or what suggestions do you have for those teachers or for educational policymakers or integration policymakers drawing on your insights from your research over the years?
I think, yes, thank you. I think one thing that I see that kind of cuts across all three of the presentations is really paying attention to who is excluded when we're focused on who is included, right? So I feel like in Kamran's work, it was around how do we include people well, right? What are the criteria that they need in order to belong, right? In Andrea and Verena's work, we have this highlight of what are the pathways that we give to people to belong, right? But yet we're not thinking about, and in my work, right, it's you can belong in these categories and in these spaces and in these communities, but what happens to people who cut across those, right? And how are they not paid attention to, and how are we responding to our learners, right, and to our needs, our educational needs, by only thinking about certain community needs, by only thinking about protecting one group? And how is it that in protecting, we are also obscuring, right, or denying? I think that that's the complexity, that oftentimes we are so driven by the good that we're doing that we fail to recognize, every action has a reaction, right? And so all the good that we do, there are some things that's a zero-sum game, right? It means that we deny resources to other people unless we're trying to spread them out across the board. I think that's what I would constantly be thinking about. It's like, if I'm an educator and I'm thinking about, okay, I want to foreground language minorities, how am I doing that, right? But also, who am I denying in only paying attention to language as the minoritizing category without recognizing the other ways that language obscures other forms of oppression? I think that's and then I'm gonna put my question in the chat.
Does anyone else from the speakers want to add to Maria's input?
No, I was just going to add that I just had a meeting with people from Norway about dealing with like the citizenship like changes there and stuff. And I think one of the, just as a practitioner point of view, is that we always have to be attentive to the adding of responsibilities for practitioners, where, you know, so I'll give an example. Instead of just teaching, now you're dealing with paperwork for immigration because you're part of the infrastructure and all of that. And I think it's being attentive that these things aren't necessarily normal, that become normal over time, perhaps. And just, I mean, that was from a practitioner level. That's because the politicians will come and go, but quite often, at least with adult migrant education, at least from my experience, the institution will stay there. A lot of the teachers will stay there, and a lot of the communities will be there, right? So it's, you know, what do we build that's beyond some of those things, really? I think that's my main point.
Andrea, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, I just to briefly respond to Kamran and Maria, the interesting thing about what happens in, I think, a lot of practitioners' daily lives is that all of these super complex categories that all overlap with each other, and all these identities that overlap with each other and that co-constitute each other, get reduced not only to single labels, but even worse, to like acronyms. So then these things get completely disembodied from their original purpose. And we talk about pay and PEP and PDP and BES and NAI and all these things in Italy that get completely removed from the purpose that they serve and whose purpose they serve. So I think that's something for practitioners also that's helpful to reflect on, like, what is this document that I'm filling out? Who is this helping and who is this hindering? And, you know, where does it fit into this infinite umbrella of other acronyms that you may or may not actually know what they stand for when you're filling out the form? I think that gets really, really complicated when really all of these high level questions get dealt with in fast in between classes, quick minute, 5-minute things here and there. I think it can get a little bit dangerous even.
Mm-hmm. Maria, you want to comment on that?
I wanted to add, I think the thing that Kamran and Andrea are also mentioning is like the active politicization of teaching and of education, and yet teachers continue and practitioners continue to be discouraged from taking active roles in their own politicization, right? So like that tension, I think, is another thing that we need to be thinking about. You know, Jean Anion is famous for having said, you know, the political is personal and the personal is political, but we often remove that for teachers and practitioners, and we try to present education as this politically neutral, race neutral, culturally neutral space, but it isn't, right? And so we see these policies and these ideologies imposed onto teachers through policies, right? Like having them now have to fill out these new forms, like having them have to do assessments, right? Or even engaging with these new indoctrination systems, right? But like, I think this is maybe for those of us who are teacher educators, right? We are not actively preparing teachers to engage with these political spaces in the same way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. There is two questions from the audience that I would want to read out to you. So one of them is from Meg, who is researching the revitalization of Welsh for her dissertation, and is reflecting on how Welsh, how the promotion of the Welsh language is obviously a crucial part of the Welsh culture, needs to be protected, but can also be exclusionary. So kind of reflecting also on mirroring a bit the situation in South Tyrol. And so she asked, what are your thoughts on the balance of this cultural importance and exclusion issue? So maybe Verena or Andrea, maybe you would want to first start out answering that question, and obviously everyone can chip in.
Yeah, I think obviously the two contexts are still very different, as the position of Welsh in Wales might be a different one than the position of German in South Tyrol and the position of German in Europe on the whole. But I think on the whole, like, it is not necessary that Welsh also needs to, like, that the promotion of Welsh as a language needs to necessarily be coupled with essentializing definitions of Welshness. So I think what's really important is that the concept of Welshness becomes an inclusive concept and is not tied to those ethnic, racial notions of it.
Yeah. I think we move on. I saw that there's 2 more questions actually, and we have 3 minutes left, more or less. So Sheila asks in the Q&A section, I don't know if you have seen it yet, so how the prioritization of monolingualism in promoting nationalist ideologies influences the pedagogy and assessment practices of English language instruction on a global scale, and what are the strategies that can be employed to raise awareness in the global south about the implications of such ideologies on language assessment, prompting them to reconsider the blind adoption of global language tests. I guess also pointing a bit to the colonialist, or imperialist aspect of languages that I think both Maria and Kamran addressed in their presentations. Anyone wants to try to answer this question?
I'll give it a shot. But so I think one of the, I think it's really significant. I mean, I think actually builds on what we've said before, particularly from Maria, about educating teachers as well and policymakers who want to be doing good, right? But the thing they're giving people access to the global market or whatever promises of language that have been made, and really thinking about that deeply and how that, how we dismantle some of those things. One of the things just worth pointing out here as well is also with this type of language testing is like millions and millions of pounds industry that you're working against. And I've been to events where language testers will present the problem for which the solution will be some sort of test, or like it's already set up that way, and then you've got British Council, wherever soft power institution plugging it with all their prestige. So I think it's really worth that type of education at various levels. And there's a lot of applied linguists as well who are quite happy to ride along the kind of that bandwagon as well. So it's really being informed, working and thinking of more creative ways that we can work together in dismantling these type of ideologies, I guess. That's the very short answer anyway.
Maria, do you want to ask your question directly rather than me reading it out?
Yes, happy to. I guess this is for Verena and Andrea. So Kamran's work highlights how language is used to determine citizenship. And so I'm wondering, how does language play into belonging for new community members in I can't remember how to say the second part, Tyrol, South Tyrol. How do you have to belong? Do you have to align yourself with one of these 3 linguistic communities? Can you even align yourself with one of these 3 linguistic communities? Yeah.
So administratively, you can, and as we've argued, you have to for certain purposes. But then again, this notion is it is somewhat ambiguous, as we've tried to say, because on the one hand, people talk about language groups all the time, but then when you go back, when you do a genealogy of it, it is actually something different. It is really this coupling of ethno-natio linguistic categories. And so that's where it gets difficult, because just by learning to speak the language, you don't necessarily, you institutionally acquire some, like, the ability to affiliate, but not necessarily in practice always.
Yeah, There's also something interesting that we discussed in thinking about how to explain this to kind of the people who are outside of South Tyrol. But the interesting thing is that there is this language center, you know, that exists to facilitate integration. And so, okay, not perfect, right? Because you don't want to integrate, you want to have, you know, a kind of emergent bilingual, you know, friendly environment in schools, not just indoctrinating into one language group's practices. But the interesting thing is that the language centers only serve to integrate from outside of those three language groups. They don't integrate across, and they can't integrate across. So you can't take an Italian, like what's happening with the, well, maybe the Danish situation is, well, I won't comment on that, but the you can't take Italian speaking children and teach them how to become German-speaking children via the language center, but you can take children from elsewhere and help them acquire Italian, if that makes sense, or German. So the whole thing is very, everyone's rights touch up against everyone else's rights, and so then when you have needs that get factored into the picture, they don't have anywhere to go. So it's kind of it's a very full but kind of tense situation that I think needs to, with the changing of, you know, everything is happening now, all the globalization, the percentages will inevitably shift in the region. And I think that there needs to be a way to talk about these things in a non-implicit way, but like say what are their concerns for real, and what can we do about them? So, but yeah, it's very delicate. The whole thing is very delicate.
Maybe on this note, we wrap up the webinar. So it's all very delicate. And we have to do things about it. So both, it's a topic that's very important for both for us in research, but also, and maybe especially for those who are actually working in their day-to-day life with students or with other people who are really affected by all those different aspects that we discussed today, not just on a theoretical level, but on a very practical level. So I would like to thank our 4 speakers today for the very interesting, very fascinating contributions. You gave us lots of food for thought. I would also thank the audience and for their questions and their attention. We don't have a date for the next webinar yet, but do check our website where we'll publish the upcoming webinars. There will be one next month and then again in June. So if you like this one, do follow us and do come back to us. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening, night, depending from where you are from listening into, and hope to see you soon again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Johanna.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, this was wonderful. Thanks.
Very, very quick, but good.